So let's go now to Sara Yael Hirschhorn in Jerusalem. She's a historian and political analyst of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She's also a visiting instructor at the University of Haifa. Thanks so much for joining us, Sara. Is Israel's democracy at stake with this new law?
Well, it certainly brings into question some checks and balances that are really lacking in the democratic system of Israel between the High Court, the parliament, and the executive. This new reasonableness law that was passed this week has certainly called into question the ability of the Supreme Court to make findings that would hold other branches of government accountable and to have more reflective power over what is happening across the country, and to be more accountable to this, and to make the government more accountable to its citizens.
So the Supreme Court, from what I understand, will hear petitions against the law in September, which will set the stage for a serious clash between Netanyahu's government and the justices. Could the Supreme Court strike this law down, and would Netanyahu obey it if they did?
So in a recent interview that Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, gave this week, he dodged that question about whether he would obey the Supreme Court's ruling should it strike down the reasonableness law and restore this test to judicial function. So it really remains to be seen what will happen. But I think it's not only a question of whether the executive himself would obey the law, but whether the masses in the street, including his supporters and the rest of his parliamentary coalition, would go along with the Supreme Court ruling, even if Netanyahu himself was willing to abide, because it seems at the moment that Netanyahu has often lost control of his coalition and some of his supporters in the street. So that all remains to be seen in September.
And there's some nervousness around the economy too. Israeli authorities have been speaking with the US media to try and soothe rising anxiety among international investors in Congress too, and of course in the American Jewish community. What could be the economic consequences, or already perhaps is, what are the economic consequences? And of course the knock-on effect, how might the relationship between the US and Israel be impacted by all of this?
Well, one of the really interesting features of the more recent weeks of protest is the activism of the high-tech and economic leadership community within the judicial reform protest movement. High-tech executives took out ads in all pages of all 5 major Israeli dailies this week in response to the passing of the reasonableness law in the Knesset to signal their antipathy to this governmental power grab. And business leaders closed malls and shops in solidarity with protesters as the reasonableness bill was being debated in Knesset, to demonstrate that the economic community is fully behind the protest movement and the pro-democracy camp in Israel. At the same time, it seems that Moody's and other economic authorities are very nervous about the current situation in Israel, including the devaluation of the shekel against the dollar. And this is hitting the pocketbooks of the average Israeli hard, given that the price of major goods, including milk, have gone up 10% in the last month. Similarly, public transportation has gone up 12% in the last month. And the continuing economic uncertainty will certainly affect the average Israeli, who is already struggling vis-a-vis his peers in the OECD. More largely, the economic relationship also has a major role to play in US-Israel relations. It is being reported that many Israelis, high-tech companies, doctors, and other professionals are thinking about immigrating abroad, leaving Israel, perhaps for the United States or for Europe. And the key economic relationship between Israel and the United States will certainly be weakened because of this crisis.
What about in terms of the Israel-Palestinian conflict? Is there any knock-on effect in terms of what's happening there at the moment, but also in relation to the fact that military units critical to national defense are warning that they're not going to volunteer for duty if the Jewish state ceases to be a proper democracy?
Yeah, there's certainly a concern that there'll be some kind of military or security establishment intervention in politics, because of the growing threat of the domestic unrest is weakening the capacity of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and other security services to act against Israel's enemies. The Palestinian front, however, has been relatively quiet. We haven't really seen Palestinians themselves responding to this judicial reform debate. Neither have Arab citizens of Israel really taken part in the protest movement, because I think they don't see this issue as really affecting their status in a positive way. Frankly, in Israel, they don't feel that the pro-democracy movement actually represents them. We are increasingly seeing the appearance of the democracy question being expanded beyond territorial Israel or Israeli domestic questions, in that the protest movement has recently been embracing more symbolism, at least, of the question of the occupation and whether any kind of Israeli democracy can exist with or without any of the judicial reform questions if Israel continues to rule over the Palestinians. But I think for the most part, this is largely a conservative status quo movement that is interested in questions about Israeli domestic politics and is leaving the Palestinian question and larger questions of democracy in the region aside.
Sara Yael Hirschhorn, thank you so much for your very in-depth insight.
Thank you very much for having me.